Well, hello and welcome. My name is Taiwo Afolabi. I'm the creator and the host of this series titled People, Planet, and Performance from Africa to the World. It's really interesting. Flo and I were just chatting a few seconds ago about how everything is really flying. This is the fifth episode in this series, and really we have two more to go. It's been really exciting because right from the beginning, I started myself and Aliyah Kassam really talked about environmental theater and climate justice in Africa. We really we asked the questions, how did we get here? And how do we move forward? We moved after that, we went on in the second episode, we talked about eco-theater, decolonizing the colonized narrative with Ugutu Muraya and Jehoshaphat Philip Sabar. And we were really looking at the ways and practices that colonial narratives have been decolonized. Specifically, we looked at their work. And we came out of that session with the idea that we need to ask ourselves questions all the time. Why are we doing things the way we're doing them? Is it because of the way it was passed down to us? Or we just thought about it? Because a lot of the times, these practices could be a perpetuation of colonial narrative. After that, we went on to talk about retooling green tools for theater in Africa. We engaged Adam Mapol and Harriet Ajoho, and we were looking at insights from their practice, particularly looking at from a design standpoint. We looked at a series of eco-friendly design and practices, and we also came out of that session really asking ourselves the question, the need to challenge some of the practices that have been handed down to us. And as we think globally, that we need to act locally and personally. Last week, it was a great time talking to Emma Mossi and Anna Maria Nabiria, and we talked about the responses to climate crises and emergencies, storytelling from the performing arts. Both of them shared their experience as artists of African descent, both from Ghana, from Uganda and Nigeria, and sort of their work in these spaces, particularly the power of storytelling, not just only as an effective tool, a therapeutic tool, but also as a tool to critique, challenge, unpack the world and the realities where we find ourselves. Today, I have the privilege to be chatting with Angela Umo1, and my apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. Angela is going to introduce herself. And today we're focusing on eco-themes in climate action. We're looking at eco-themes in climate action. What impact can the eco-theme genre make in the journey towards climate justice in Africa? My sincere gratitude goes to HowlRound for creating the platform for this conversation. Thanks to our partner, Center for Sustainable Practices in the Arts, CSPA, the Center for Socially Engaged Theater at the University of Regina, where I'm the director, and of course, our theater partner, Theater Emsuri International. We also thanks Flo, who is our project manager, and thanks to Victor and Tanya, who have been our ASL interpreters, and of course, our live captioners. I'm dialing in today from the territory of the Anishinaabe, Dakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Mischief Nations, where the University of Regina is situated, where I am both a Canada researcher in social engaged theater and the director of the Center for Social Engaged Theater. Without further ado, I'd like to call on Angela to introduce herself, and then we'll get the conversation started. Over to you, Angela.
Hey, Taiwo, thank you so much for having me. I am so thrilled to be a part of the conversation and the community that you've been building over the last couple of episodes of this series, and I'm really thankful to be here. I'd like to just quickly apologize. You're not seeing my smile and the twinkle in my eyes, and really it's just because I have struggled with anxiety from when I was a child, and it was made acute during the COVID pandemic era, where we were all on Zoom and all on all the time, and I really haven't recovered, but hopefully I will find my way back to being able to be on camera in conversation with other people. My name is Angie Emuron. I am a Ugandan filmmaker, writer, theater maker, and dramaturg. I'm speaking to you from Tororo, Uganda, in the eastern part of Uganda. I'm about 4 to 5 hours from the capital city, Kampala, about 20 to 30 minutes from the Kenya-Uganda border of Malaba. That's where I'm speaking to you from. And I am an award-winning playwright, award-winning filmmaker, and a dramaturg. And really, I like the word dramaturg more than mentor, because it says that I know some things, but I am very new to the work I'm looking at right now. And it sort of gives us wiggle room to sort of find the pathway together. My artistic process is rooted in the process of making the work is just as important as the work itself. And so I try to build communities and build spaces where we can all do our best work and challenge ourselves artistically with my collaborators. And that's sort of the space I occupy as a dramaturg as well as a practicing artist. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I want to say thank you for taking care of yourself. Deeply appreciate that. I think what we've learned over the years, particularly with COVID, has shown us is that as artists, we give and give and give and give and give. And many times, nothing and no system, nothing, no one takes care of us. And so we end up having ourselves, both singular and ourselves, plural, to take care of ourselves. So I'm happy that you, please, on that journey of healing, recuperation, I'm really excited that you're on that journey, and we're sending you all the love and all the grace. And thank you for being part of the episode, this series today. One thing I try to do before we dive into the conversation is to highlight some couple of artists who are from the continent of Africa, who are doing, whose work kind of focus on, climate issues. I have a series of names. I'm just going to run through them today. And, our listeners and viewers later can check them out. And if you have any question or you have anyone you want us to give a shout out to, please, by all means, send it our way. The first person on my list today is El Anansui, born in 1944. They are Ghanaian. And they use a lot of their work touches upon wider society issues that concern the development of Africa, and they use sculpture to make that commitment and that kind of contribution to issues that are critical to environmental crises in Africa. The second person is Sana Gateja, and maybe Angie, you might know this person. They are from Uganda, and they were born in 1950. Now, just to let everybody know, anyone that I'm doing a shout out to here, I'm not paid to do it. It's just, and I don't know them. Most of them I don't, except those that are living, that I maybe partner with in one form or another. But most of them I don't know them. So it's just a way just to give visibility to the work happening on the continent. Sana Gateja is a painter, a mixed media artist, and jewelry designer who is widely known for his signature incorporation of recycled man-made waste materials in his practice, particularly his pioneering fashioning of beads from discarded paper which earned him the nickname the Bead King in Uganda. Possibly, like I said, Angie may know them. The third person is Romuald Hazume from the Republic of Benin. They were born in 1962. They're multidisciplinary artists whose work spans photography, sculpture, mask. They also work on canvas and installations, and they use these forms, these art forms, to engage issues of climate crisis on the continent. The fourth person is Mkal Yogakpa. They are from Cameroon, born in 1981. Is a very young and versatile artist whose background in studying botany and ecology informs his practice, his artistic practice, which is, when I read about them, I find it very interesting because they're bringing that knowledge from the world of botany and ecology to inform their practice. They use photography, video, sculpture, sound, text, performance, and all of that. And that would be all I'm going to shine what I'm going to mention today. So you can go and if you're interested, go read more about them. And then the remaining 2 episodes, we also look for other artists from other part of the region, from different part of the region, particularly those that we've not necessarily highlighted over the past 5 episodes. So we want to come back to this. So Angie, I'd like you to speak about your journey. I love when you started by saying that you love the idea of you part of your own philosophy of your work, if I may use that, is understanding that the process is critical to the product, is as critical as the product. And that's really important, because then it's not just only product driven, it's also process led and process driven. I'd like you to just speak to us about your own journey into the world of eco-film and what got you there. Of course, you're an established playwright and award-winning playwright. What just together for us to just get to know how your journey into that world.
All right, so I'm just going to warn you, I'm a storyteller, so brace yourself. So my journey, my journey into like thinking as an eco-artist or somebody who is concerned about the environment and concerned about climate change really began as a child. So my parents went into exile during the Idi Amin era to nearby Kenya. And so I grew up in a very idyllic at the coast of Kenya in Mombasa. So the ocean and all of that beauty. And my only understanding of Uganda was coming to visit my grandparents. And usually it was in the rural area. Now, Uganda is one of the most biodiverse places on earth and incredibly beautiful. I am biased, but this is the truth. And I was just stunned by how incredibly beautiful Uganda was as a child every time that I would come. And so that was imprinted in my mind in terms of just what a wealth of culture, biodiversity, flora and fauna, just on a journey, like let's not even talk about going on safari or anything like that, just taking a trip to go and visit my grandparents who live on opposite sides of the country. Followed by when I now returned to Uganda, because now this idea had been put in my head that I have to live in the most beautiful place on earth, which is Uganda. When I returned, the first job I got was as a tourism manager for an eco company, a company that practiced ecotourism. And so that again solidified the ways in which we can enjoy and partake of the gifts of nature in an eco-friendly way. And that was another way that that idea was put into my mind. And then finally, when I left that job to become an artist full-time, to pay the bills, I used to take eco-agriculturalists to visit each other across East Africa. So to meet each other and talk about how the practices they're doing as eco-agriculturalists. And that's what I used to do to pay the bills. And so again, I was spending time with people who were seriously thinking about the ways they can harness the land, the natural gifts and to create a cycle of health for the land rather than a linear from planting to product, but a cycle where essentially the earth was replenishing itself. And also the materials that came out of that were eco-friendly and organic. So that was my way into thinking seriously about what it means to be a human being on this earth, as a steward, as a contributor. And then when I began to write plays, I was approached by Climate Change Theatre Action to write a play thinking about climate change. And I have climate change and the questions of climate change and the questions of the climate crisis. And I have written 3 plays with them, which again helped me to delve even deeper into what can I do as an artist. It's very clear to my mind that I'm not an activist. That is not who I am, not in the classic sense of how we say what an activist is. I have many preoccupations in terms of storytelling and things that I want to say, and I'm generally led by what is preoccupying me at the time. But the climate crisis and eco-filmmaking is very, very important to me. And in the last play that I wrote, when it was being published, the lovely people at Climate Change Theatre Action asked, what are you putting into your artistic practice that is a small step towards being a part of this conversation? And I made a deal with myself that in the process of making work, I'm going to try and reduce the impact in very small ways, the impact on the climate, the impact on my community in terms of eco filmmaking, but also I will try and put a conversation in the larger story that addresses climate change and climate justice. So that's kind of how I come to this.
Thank you so much for taking us through that journey. I think that our journey into whatever we're doing is critical, because then it's many times it forms the pillar upon which we're standing, our beliefs and all that. We asked this question, and it's a very simple question, but permit me. What does even ecofilm mean to you? What is it?
What ecofilm means to me is that we are creating an environment in which our work is sustainable, builds community, and does no harm. That's really it's very simplistic, but really that's what I believe, is that we are creating work that builds community and is sustainable and has low impact on the environment. Yeah. And of course, it has its challenges, but that's the bedrock of how I approach filmmaking.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I was looking at the Portland Eco Film Festival. So there is Eco Film Festival already, because we know that, and I will speak to that in a minute. Because a lot of the film traditional or the big, the giant film production, different woods that we have, from Hollywood to Nollywood to Kannywood to, Kenya wood, whatever, all the woods that we have. I don't know if you also have Uganda wood. All the woods that we have. The practice, the film, to what extent, the question many times is, to what extent are these productions and their ways of working and engaging on the story they are telling, in what ways are they contributing to the discourse on sustainability and even regenerative, sustainability and regenerative design of that, and also in what ways that their stories and what they're doing really advocating for an eco-friendly environment? And that question is still on the table, as you know. That's the truth, because of, again, of the war, of that particular world. A festival like Portland Eco Film Festival, and they showcase, according to them, they showcase best themes about nature, about environment, about outdoor pursuits and ecological living. In fact, according to them, their mission is to use the art of cinema, a more active, empowered, diverse, and connected community of environmental advocates. Now, you did say that you don't see yourself as an activist, and I want to come back to that, because some of your work that I've read, it sounds otherwise. Can you speak to that? And maybe again, that's the tension or that's the, that's where you're sitting, because your piece with, climate action initiative, it basically speaks to all these issues that, that has been outlined in this mission statement. Anyway, I'll allow you to speak to that.
Wow. I have so many thoughts running through my mind. First is that sometimes the way the film industry is built, it is built to in some ways it is built to seem or to come across as a meritocracy. So the best work, the best work comes forward and so on, and that's where resources and money and people will go towards that. And then, of course, you have, for instance, the Portland Eco Film Festival. That's right. The spaces like that where they have been created for filmmakers who are using their art to speak about the challenges that we are facing as a global community. And I definitely know filmmakers that work in this and with singular purpose. And this is really where their focus is in terms of content and also process. So the process of making their film is in line with the tenets and the ideas of eco-filmmaking and sustainability, but also the content of their film is within that same line. And to take a leaf from you, I'm going to shout out one of my favorite filmmakers, Ugandan filmmaker Nikisi Serumaga Jamo, who is right now working on a piece that is looking at the effects of secondhand clothing on the environment, but also the economy of Uganda as a case study for Africa. And to go on this journey, she has a pretty fantastic podcast called Vintage of Violence that people can check out. And she's very clear that she's using her art as provocation, as discovery, as wanting to understand how Uganda, which was once a cotton producing country, and cotton was the bedrock of our economy, and we used to wear our own clothes made by our own cotton, is now an importer of secondhand clothes. And I applaud filmmakers that do this. Or, for instance, filmmakers who talk about like the havoc of single-use plastics on land, on agriculture, and so on and so forth. These are filmmakers that are very clear what their work is about. The reason why I say that I wouldn't really say that I am a climate change activist is just because of the respect and honor I have for the filmmakers that work in this area and really have devoted their lives to do this. And what I feel like is that what I am is a supporter a collaborator. And how I collaborate is that I am trying to think about what is a, spoonful of sugar with the medicine in the area in which I work. And so if I'm telling a silly love story, what can I put in it as a spoon, to give the sugar with the medicine? And then also, what can I interrogate my process and figure out in what ways am I having impact on my community, on sustainability, and on the environment? So in that way, I see myself as a collaborator with these artists rather than a vanguard, just because of the amount of thinking and work that their work entails. And I wouldn't dare to put myself in the same bracket.
Interesting. I love your your positionality, and also understanding that you're part of the ecosystem. Even you may not term yourself advocate or activist and all that, but you're thinking, how can I support? And I think that's really, really critical, particularly when we start thinking about our various responsibilities and roles. And I'm going to come back to that in a sec, because I think yesterday when we were having our prep meeting, I was talking about the fact that one thing that we've been thinking about in these episodes, the past episodes, and really the entire series, is that the more we think globally, I think we need more to think locally and personally. And so I'm going to still come back to that in your own work, how you're sort of thinking about that and the things you're doing. But while we're still on the conversation about the industry itself, about their process, the products, and everything in between, from the marketing to casting to the stories and everything that is done within the film world. I wanted to ask you, in what ways have films that are produced in Africa specifically responded to the discourse of climate change, in your opinion? Have they even responded to it in any way, or yeah, anyway, I'm just trying to broaden the question, so it's not just in one way. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
I think that while in Africa and on this continent, we have been the least, just in terms of emissions, the least contributors to the climate change crisis. We are experiencing some of the some pretty critical effects of this. One of it is just quite a bit of drought, and then areas that used to be semi-arid are moving more towards becoming arid.
Yep.
There is movement of people from these areas into urban areas that is causing pressure on facilities or infrastructure. And then you create, for instance, what are they called? Temporary settlements that don't have the right amenities, which again leads to, clogging of the sewer systems and so on and so forth. And it's just a cycle of perpetuating destruction, to put it mildly. And so when you have African filmmakers from these contexts telling the stories from this particular lens, which is that, and this is my personal opinion, which is for a lot of people, their lives are about making ends meet. For a large percent of I'm going to speak about Uganda. The statistics is 60 to 70% live below the poverty line. And then the statistics on unemployment for young people. We have a very young nation. 70% of our young people are under 35. And so what sort of employment can these people find? And then all of them are have passed through an education system that is talking about white collar jobs, as opposed to harnessing their environment in order to be able to innovate and find new ways of making a living. And so agriculture or working the land is being abandoned for these city lives or city dreams, you know? And so the question of through what lens are filmmakers telling these stories? I feel that African filmmakers are very powerful because they are standing in a place of creation and enlightenment and hope. Because it's very easy to look at Africa through the lens of everything that I've mentioned and see there is no hope here. But we do make a life, we do have joy, we do have big dreams. And so what does it mean for us to steward our community and our lives in order for those dreams to be achievable? That is a lens that I think is important for African filmmakers, to be able to say, yes, we have this problem, and by and large, we have the solutions, and this is the dream we have for our future. Because the conversation on climate change and climate justice has always been a conversation that is had in the West, and then solutions are sent. That this is how I think we should go about this. Whereas these young people are living in this situation and are much able to see that we have are able to innovate and come up with ideas and innovations from their place, from where they sit, from their perspective. And one of my what is it called? The things that I have discovered as I told you my story about how I came to understand climate change, is that there are people working in indigenous traditional ways to perpetuate this cycle. They're just doing it in a small corner of their lives. And if we gave them the tools with which to be able to say, here is what I'm doing in my small corner of the world. I have this knowledge that we have had in perpetuity, and then I have this knowledge that you are disseminating from the West, and together we can innovate. My thinking is that there is no one solution. There has to be a multi-pronged solution to this, and we all have something to say. And so for African, Ugandan filmmakers to be able to give this perspective in these films, rather than responding to a Western idea or a Western solution, I think has value. The question is, who is resourcing them? You know, because that determines how you approach the story. Who is resourcing them? And we have filmmakers that are coming up with innovative ways with which to say, I want to tell the story from my perspective, and this might be a better way for me to go around it, rather than entering into the already built film structure of co-productions and Hollywood and so on and so forth. And so it's quite exciting, but it's a pretty slow movement.
Angie, I think some couple of things you kind of touched on. I will try to highlight them, and it's not to, to simplify what you've said, because it's very complex. But what I'm hearing, first of all, is the idea that we have to think of these in a very holistic sense. And I think we talked about that at some point in one of the episodes, that we have to address this in a holistic setting, right? In the holistic sense of, you were talking about unemployment and how people are moving away from the villages and, tending to the land, to white collar jobs, due to, of course, globalization, due to so many things. And so we have to think about climate, discourse on the continent in that holistic sense, the economy, the social, the political, the cultural, and even at times the spiritual. But the other layer, and the other layer to that, that I also hear you from what you're also saying is we also have to focus on the population that we have, particularly on the continent, knowing fully well that we have this huge percentage of young, vibrant people who can harness, have the potential to harness the environment, have the potential to engage rather than just go to the white collar jobs and all of that, but that they can really creatively innovate. But then you ended up, you asked the question, who is resourcing them? And I think that's a very powerful question, particularly when we start thinking about agency, control, who defines and directs the narratives, and also how does this then speak to, amplifying understanding and amplifying the local practices and ways of doing things, so that we don't always rely on the solutions that come from the other, that come particularly from the West. And I think this point that you're touching on are really important, particularly when we think about the innovation. So as you're talking, I just remember, and I don't know if the same thing in Uganda. In Nigeria, I would imagine it might be the same. You have examples of that. And this is not in any way film, but there's these in recent times, over the past few years, there is a whole genre that has evolved on the continent. In Nigeria, for example, the skits, the comedy skits. I don't know if you have that in Uganda. Like the comedy skits are just so powerful that in 2 minutes, in 3 minutes, folks are able to say the things they need to say. They've simplified production line that they use just phone to make it work. It's just one character, and they build depth into that over the years. Like in an example comes to mind, Mr. Macaroni in Nigeria. We have and we have many examples like that in Nigeria, and I would imagine it's the same in Uganda. So when you are saying that empowering and creating that space for the young minds to be able to explore and really bring out their creativity and innovation, it's a very powerful understanding and sort of like a way to move forward that I think we need to think about, of course, within the context of ecofilm, because then those forms of innovation can change the game when it comes to film production. Anyways,
100%.
yeah, I'm just rambling around just to kind of just highlight some of those things you've talked about, but I just wanted to highlight that because I think that what it's really very interesting to see the interconnection and the relationship of the various aspects of our lives and how that then affect the film, the cinema world, right?
Right.
That then takes me to my next question for you. You earlier on, you were talking about process. And being a dramaturg, and I can see clearly, and of course I know that you're a dramaturg. The ability to be able to sit down with a question or even ask questions and unpack it and flip it over and revise it. That's a luxury that I think dramaturgs have, which we're grateful for. I wanted to know more about your process, or if you can speak more to your process, because I think that it seems to me that all of these things that you're thinking about in your own practice kind of sieve through in your process, in terms of how you amplify those stories that have, that speaks to the issues in Uganda, environmental issues, how you also frame your relationship with people so that they can understand the bigger context. So if you can speak to your own process and also highlight your practice within that.
Sure. So I think one of the really interesting things in wanting to become a storyteller is the idea of voice. You as an artist having your particular voice. And as you go about storytelling, you will hear every so often somebody saying there are no new stories. There are seven basic plot lines, and we find interesting ways to recycle these stories over and over again. And so the question then becomes, what do I have to say? And then how do I want to say what I want to say? And I feel like that it becomes the core of my process as a dramaturg, is to work with somebody to be able to answer those questions. What do I want to say? And how do I want to say the things I want to say? Secondly, we are at a point where content is readily available. There is content being produced every single day, and we are slowly but surely are heading towards a more niche type of storytelling. And so if you're particularly interested in a certain type of storytelling, you can live in that world and not touch any other kind of story for a really long time and not feel the loss. When I was growing up in the 80s, 90s, there would be this one big film or this one big story that would come out, and globally we would all experience this together. As it is right now, even within my sibling group, we have very different interests, and we can go maybe years without our interests interconnecting. You know, this person likes horror. I don't like to be scared. I will not watch that. Or I like to be immersed in the story of the human spirit and who we are as people, and somebody just wants some escapism. And so we are creating, because of streaming and so on, very niche little bubbles that you can live in and not experience any other kind of storytelling. And so the question now is, as a Ugandan filmmaker, as a young Ugandan, how do you, in this global space, find your voice and find a way to have something to say that it connects, where you feel seen, you feel heard, you feel understood, and then finally can actually make a living? And so these are the important questions when I sit down with young artists. And really, one of the things that has been really instrumental in my own work is the idea of stories containing culture, and stories containing identity, and stories telling us who we are and how we make ourselves and unmake ourselves using stories. And so I always spend a lot of time finding out, or rather asking, how would this story have been told by your grandmother or your grandmother? What would they have used to carry this very big idea you're trying to grapple with? And then what is being said in your particular niche in this area? And now finally, you grapple, because in there somewhere is your history, in there somewhere are the things that formed you, because you're not just formed by your ancestry, you're also formed by the world we live in now, which is super connected. You know, a young person in Nigeria can be very, very similar to a young person in Uganda and a young person in Canada. They are imbibing the same kind of content almost every day. And so what do you want to say that is particular to you? And that's really where we spend a lot of the time, trying to discover, what's your voice? What do you want to say? And how do you want to say it? What medium would you like to use to say that? And that's really my main process as a dramaturg. In my own work, really, I feel sometimes that I am, in a way, parenting myself through my work. Is I am trying to understand, because I grew up in a culture that was not mine, with a very, very distinct identity of my culture. So I've always been Ugandan, always. There is no question about that. But I grew up in a culture that wasn't that, and I find those spaces in myself as well. And so it is to essentially parent myself to find out, who am I really, separate from these nationalistic identities, and how do I see the world, and where do I locate myself in it? And so I feel like my work is usually weaving in and out about that, about those ideas. And it's, again, me finding my voice. Yeah.
Thanks, Angie. I love when you're saying find your voice, tell your story. It reminds me of James Cameron's, Avatar, The Way of Water, which is a global sensation. And of course, there are other documentaries like the Nigerian Oil Thief, the True Price of Crude Oil. There's Delta Blues, and these are various stories. These are stories and examples that, that the global North have kind of told the story of global South, or even specifically of Africa. And so when you're saying find your voice, determine the story you want to tell, the medium in which you want to tell it, then tell your story. I think that's very powerful. And it's a reminder that if we don't tell our stories, someone is going to tell it for us.
100%.
And I think that I'm hoping, and like you said, a lot of content happening out all the time and every day. But what's the quality of the content, the kind of story that is being told? Are we discovering our own identity and reasserting our identity, or taking on the identity of the other? And I think those are really, really interesting questions that that I think that it's worth exploring, both in the process and hopefully that can then help us to also think about the practice, how we're doing things. So like you rightly said, it's not just a story alone, but how you want to tell the story. We have 12 more minutes, and then I always invite our viewers or listeners if they have any questions. So far there is none. I want to ask you, in terms of more an aspirational question here, an envisioning, and it's really the question around what impact do you think that eco-film genre can make on, towards issues of climate change in Africa? And I do understand that we're grappling with very complex situations, complex things. But with this kind of genre, what impact do you think it can have in all of these complexities that we're grappling with? Because as a continent, we're grappling with so many things politically, of course, economically, culturally, and all the other, and otherwise. So, in your opinion, what impact do you think this kind of genre of film can help us, can make on this discourse of climate justice on the continent?
I think one impact is that I feel like we would be able to see it, because sometimes when you are inside it, you don't see it as clearly. You don't connect the dots. That deforestation here leads to um, what is it? Deforestation here leads to bad governance can lead to deforestation here. Deforestation here to whole communities losing their homes, because all over Africa, I know that there are communities where forests were their home and their way of living. I know we have a community in Uganda that's like that. And so if you take away their home, their livelihood, then they have to come out into a world that they don't understand, similar to what is happening in the Amazon forest, for instance. And so that when you connect those dots to your hardwood floors in your house that you insisted must be hardwood from wherever it is, when you see this film, you're able to connect the dots and I feel make better decisions. Say, perhaps we need a more eco-friendly way of creating living spaces. Perhaps we need to find a more eco-friendly way of creating community or clean energy and all of those things. You had a discourse on one of the episodes where you were talking about all the mining that is going on in and around Africa, when we are all having a discussion about moving away from fossil fuels. So for a person to be able to connect the dots beyond this salary I receive this month from doing this job, and to be able to see the wider picture, I think these films are very instrumental in that. And then secondly, there is a sense of community where you don't feel alone. Sometimes you can, the idea of climate change can be so overwhelming and you feel really, really small. And perhaps you not littering or you being more aware of what is happening in the ocean and your contribution to that, or you standing in line at a strike, you can feel like your attempts are insignificant. But when a filmmaker puts out a film that shows your community, your people engaging with this question, it enables you to not feel alone. It enables you to see your small contributions in context as something we are doing together. And I feel like that's really, really important. Unfortunately, I don't know that I can say the name of the film. I'm so sorry. I don't think I can say the name of the film, but a group of African filmmakers met in a European country, and one of the filmmakers showed a film that was very clear about how bad governance was contributing to climate change. And as we sat in that room, maybe 12 or 13 of us, for the non-African audience, it was another conversation in this story. It was something that they had seen before, understood, or I'm not explaining it very well. But for the 12 or 13 of us, we saw ourselves. We saw the ways in which we are complicit. We saw the ways in which we look away. We saw the ways, for example, the protagonist was us. And it was such a somber moment for all of us to just understand what it means to be involved in the electoral process as a way of safeguarding our environment. And we saw it as if it was our home, our very home, being destroyed. That's how powerful that film was. And so these films are useful in that way, and these filmmakers are useful, are doing an incredible job, especially filmmakers who tell that story from their point of view as Africans in the diaspora, with a connection to this continent, it's really powerful.
Well, thank you so much, Angie. Yeah, thank you for articulating that clearly. The kind of story that we tell and its connections to every aspect of our lives, and it brings it to to life right in front of us, and we can see it. It's like a mirror, right? It reflects, it refracts, and is able to challenge us to rethink whatever we're doing. At this point, I'd like to say thank you. We've been having a chat with you for almost an hour, so thank you for taking the time to chat with us today in this episode, in this series. And then I'd like to thank HowlRound for creating the platform to have this conversation, and thanks to Center for Socially Engaged Theater, CSET, at the Center for Sustainable Practices in the Arts and Theater Industry International. And of course, thanks to Flor Gomez, who's been our project manager, and to Victor and Tanya for being our ASL interpreters, and of course, our live captions. Thank you for Angie again. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. I think you've shared with us from your heart, really, not just only your practice, but your perspective around ecofilm, and a lot of the things we need to think about, particularly around finding our voice, sharing our stories, and always considering how we are telling those stories. And beyond that, also really looking at how the complexities of our realities, and how these stories can bring all of these things closer to us, so that we start seeing ourselves, and hopefully we can start challenging the system where we need to challenge it, and also to ask ourselves what's my role, and how can I think globally, act locally, and also act personally. So and so thank you, Angie, for taking the time. With that, do you have any other thing you want to say?
I just want to thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Angie. Deeply appreciate that. Well, without further ado, thank you so much for being here today. We'll be again next week, same time, 12 p.m. EST, and then it's 10 a.m. my time in Regina. And then next week, we're going to be, it's our 6th episode. And so next week, we're going to be considering performance and climate finance and sustainability, capital and planetary justice. And the focus of that episode is really, we're going to be looking at capital, because the reality is that we can't talk about capital finance. We can't talk about sustainability without talking about finance and capital. And we've talked about the complexity and how intertwined all of these ideas are. So next week, we're going to have Naomi Andrew Haruna, myself. We're going to be talking about the role, the connection of sustainability, climate issues to finance and capital, and how they impact, influence, shape one another. And then because it's indeed the elephant in the room, or at least one of the elephants in the room that we need to talk about. And we thank you so much for being here, and then looking forward to having you again next week, Wednesday. From my end, bye, and have a lovely day.